Good morning.
Hey guys, how you going?
Good, good.
Thanks for agreeing to come on. Like you're a pretty big name in the space, and I certainly listen to the Daily Gwei every day when I go to get my coffee. Big fan.
Yeah, thank you.
See, I'm
Great to be here.
I'm the opposite. I always read the newsletters,
He
so I
didn't
get
know there
the
was a YouTube till yesterday.
Oh, really? I got to do a better job
yeah.
of advertising that then.
It's a,
No, that's not on you. That's on me. So
Fair enough, fair enough.
All right. We wanted to bring you on because a lot of our community, this is their first sort of crypto investment into Ohm, and a lot of people think it's going to be the future global settlement layer for people to build on top of. And we thought there's no one better to educate people about Ethereum and what's being built on top of it and roll-ups and the future of it, because we're obviously an Ethereum-based protocol, safest out of all the blockchains, and we're very happy to have our security guaranteed by the Ethereum network. So maybe you can tell us why Ethereum's the best place to build on, and then we can sort of go back and forth, and I'm sure you've got a lot to say about Ethereum.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on for hours about why I think Ethereum is, the best place to build on, the best ecosystem out there. But I guess from a high level, I just think that Ethereum isn't the only blockchain out there, right? There's other layer one chains. There's other ones that are hostile and want to compete and steal Ethereum's market share. There's ones that have been around for almost as long as Ethereum, not live. They've been in ideation. They raised money. They've been building things like that. And then there's been newer ones that haven't been around as long. And I think what I always look at is what's around now versus what was around a few years ago. Why did the other chains fail to gain adoption? What does Ethereum do differently? All that sort of stuff. And I think at the heart of all of it is Ethereum just has an incredibly strong and resilient community of people. There's a very, very strong core community that have been around for a long time, like even longer than I have. I got into Ethereum in early 2017, but there's plenty of people who have been around since basically day one and have stuck with Ethereum the whole time. And I asked, like, why is that? Like, why do people stick around? Why do they still care many, many years on? Like, why do they not jump ship to another kind of chain that maybe is offering them something new or more money or to kind of like work there? Or maybe they think that Ethereum is inferior because it's got high gas fees and whatever. But I think what it all comes back to is that the community has a set of values, a mission, an ethos around it. They have a lot of network effects themselves and social capital they've built up within Ethereum. They've got a lot of friends. If they're a developer, they're used to kind of like the developer tooling. They're used to building on Ethereum. And there's a lot of people who understand the Ethereum roadmap and have bought in since day one, because you're talking about security of the chain and things like that. Well, the funny thing is that proof of stake, which is what Ethereum will be moving to next year, is actually being talked about by Vitalik since basically day one. It's not a new concept that Ethereum just latched onto. Ethereum has basically been a pioneer in the proof of stake space for a while. But the reason it's taken Ethereum so long to move there is because there was a few reasons, but I think a major reason is simply because it's more complex than the other proof of stake mechanisms out there. And also we have to deal with the fact that we already have a live network. Ethereum couldn't just switch over to proof of stake on the live network because that wouldn't be a safe thing to do for the network, considering how much economic activity happens on it. So, if you just kind of look at that, there's been this long-term mission to move to proof of stake. And I think that's what keeps people like really interested, and they don't change networks and say, well, this other network has proof of stake already. Why do I care about Ethereum? And, on top of that, there's also scaling efforts that have been taking place for such a long time. Like sharding has been talked about since around the same time. That's probably going to take a bit longer to kind of get released or get put to mainnet, probably 2023 sometime. And then the layer two stuff has also been worked on for quite a while. It's come and gone through different names, but we finally got to a point where, some people will be familiar with Rollups, like Arbitrum and Optimism and Starkware and ZK Sync, and then you have Polygon with Hermes and Polygon's POS chain as well. So we have all these Ethereum scalability solutions now, and people really, I think, are seeing the vision, because it's been a long and windy road for Ethereum over the years, of course. Ethereum has been the pioneer of smart contract chains, has had to try and do things what I like to call the right way, where we want to preserve Ethereum's decentralization and security. We don't want to give that up at any cost just to achieve some short to medium term scale in favor of the long term. And I think that's been both positive and maybe a little bit of a negative. Negative being that Ethereum obviously has bled users to other chains because of the fact that these other chains sacrifice decentralization and security for scale. There are certainly a lot of chains that are just basically the same as Ethereum, except pretty centralized. You know, they use the same architecture, being the EVM, which is basically the machine that powers Ethereum. Because of this stuff being open source, they can do that. But, you know, it comes back to my question. It was like, why haven't people from Ethereum, like the core community, migrated to these other chains, or why have they not switched over and just given up on Ethereum? And yeah, I just think it comes back to the fact that there's been such a long-term mission and ethos and values ingrained into the Ethereum community, and they really, really care about preserving all of that, and they don't want to give that up just to achieve some, you know, short to medium term scale, because a lot of it comes back to scaling, and they're bought into the long-term mission of it. So, you know, as I said, I could go on for hours about this, but that's probably a little bit of a high level.
Yeah, that's great. It's really interesting, the network effects of the community, and it's kind of like you see it in the NFT space. Like anyone can spin up NFTs for cheap on like a different chain, but everyone still wants the Ethereum-based NFTs because that's where everyone else is. Maybe you can tell us about your first introduction to Ethereum, and we can start way back.
Let's cycle back to 2017. I'd love to get a little bit more insights onto like what the vibe and, you know, what was the community like back then, and then you can kind of lead up into maybe some more technical questions.
Yeah. So it's funny because my crypto journey actually started in 2013 when I first discovered Bitcoin, but it didn't really extend much past that, because what ended up happening was in 2013, I rode the Bitcoin wave up, and I kind of rode through all the drama there. And then MT Gox collapsed very famously. So the Bitcoin price went with it. And then in 2014, I sold my Bitcoin and was like, yeah, whatever, I'm not interested in this ecosystem anymore, which obviously was a big mistake in hindsight. And then, you know, I missed Ethereum completely. I hadn't even heard of it until pretty much, I think it was early 2017, like Jan, Feb or something like that, where a friend basically said to me, hey, like I knew you were into Bitcoin, you know, a few years ago. How about you check out this Ethereum thing? And I'm like, okay. I was a bit skeptical because I had kind of like written off Bitcoin and crypto and been like, oh yeah, this is dead, like it's all over. I was very silly in thinking that, of course, but you know, when you're not ingrained into the ecosystem, it can be very easy to kind of dismiss this stuff. But yeah, I checked it out, and then I'm like, wow, okay, you can build applications on it. And because I'd come from like a technical background, not so much a finance background, I think I resonated much more with Ethereum than originally I did with Bitcoin, because Ethereum was more than just like the ETH token, right? You could build applications on the network, whereas with Bitcoin, it really is just like BTC, the asset. Like the whole ecosystem revolves around that asset and what that asset means in the wider context of society. So immediately I just, you know, dived right into it, started doing a ton of research, bought a little bit. My first ETH buy was around $10, but I had like hardly any money back then, so I wasn't able to buy much, unfortunately. And then, you know, the price started getting away from me because 2017, we had obviously a massive run up. I got to buy some more at $50, but then, you know, I didn't really get to buy too much at the cheaper prices, unfortunately. But, you know, I think in hindsight now, looking back, it's still a cheap price, right?
Yeah.
It's just funny how I look back on that now and be like, you know, $50 back then was like considered really expensive, considering ETH had gone from like 10 to 50 in I think a couple of months or something, and now ETH's over $4,000. Funny how things change so quickly. But yeah, that's kind of like what happened there. And then I dived into it. I was a pretty big lurker of Reddit back then. The ETH trader subreddit was place to be. Twitter wasn't really a thing, at least not for Ethereum, the Ethereum community. It was mainly Reddit. So yeah, I just lurked a lot. I didn't really have a Twitter presence. I think I had an account, but I wasn't really tweeting anything. And then, of course, I mean, you know, you asked also about like what the community was like in 2017. It was very different in the sense that it was much, much smaller, in the fact that like the core community of like core developers and core community members and contributors and everything like that, you know, they're still around today, but they were a very, very small group. There wasn't like a lot of us in the community as we exist today as kind of like being community leaders and stewards. It was really just like still the core development group that had been there since the beginning. And in 2017, I think Ethereum, I mean, it wasn't really used for anything except ICOs, right? So it attracted a lot of speculators, a lot of people just using the network to buy into and speculate on these ICOs, which they thought that they could flip for like a, you know, quick 5-10x, which you could sometimes. Like at the peak of the mania, you could basically, get into an ICO and then a couple of days later it would have gone like 10x or something, which was crazy. And then obviously that all ended after 2017, and we went into the 2018 bear market, which was, I think the 2018 bear market was very necessary for Ethereum's survival and for Ethereum to keep thriving. Because what it did was it weeded out all of the speculators and all the people that were just there for the short-term gain, and kind of brought together all of the people who actually cared, and the core community that you see today on Twitter, all the big Twitter names, all the big developers, all of that. They all got their start during maybe 2017, 2018, and really hit their strides then when the community could come together and actually all, I guess, work towards the same mission. Not really about the price or speculation, more about building something really, really cool. Building things like DeFi, of course, and DAOs and NFTs weren't really a thing back then. I mean, they were, but like not like today, of course. We obviously had the CryptoKitties mania in 2017, which kind of was like the first big NFT thing. So yeah, I mean that was kind of like 2017 and 2018. But it's funny, in 2018 the community kind of like migrated off Reddit onto Twitter. Like Twitter started becoming a much bigger piece of the Ethereum community. I started getting more active there. There are a kind of a lot more efforts happening across, I guess, like the educational space. In 2017 there wasn't much Ethereum education. People were confused. They thought all this stuff was happening when it really wasn't. And then in 2018, the way I kind of like got my start and kind of, I guess, like doing something more public was that I started a newsletter in early 2018 just covering the crypto ecosystem. I know, very, very obviously vanilla, very boring, but it was kind of like something where I was like, okay, well, I have some time outside of my normal job. I'm going to do this.
What was the newsletter called, Sassal?
Yeah, so back then it was called the Block by Block newsletter, and it's not the Block by Block newsletter anymore. It became the EthHub newsletter. It's like a weekly newsletter now. It became EthHub after my co-founder Eric and I started EthHub in late 2018, and we have like a newsletter and a podcast and a website with all the Ethereum information on it. Because back then in 2018 there was no Ethereum media at all. There was no Bankless, there was no Defiant, there was no DeFi Dad or any of the other ones out there today. It was really just like EthHub. And the funny thing is we started EthHub because the Ethereum.org website was horrible. It hadn't been updated since like 2014 or 2015. It had lots of outdated information on it, and we didn't know when it was going to get updated. So we got frustrated and built our own information hub. And I think that really did help people during that kind of like time as well to really understand what Ethereum was. And then, of course, Ethereum.org is much better today. It's one of the best resources for Ethereum out there. But it's funny how back then that was kind of like totally non-existent, and it's why a major reason why we started EthHub, because in 2018 there was a lot of misinformation about Ethereum, like a ton of it on Twitter, especially from everyone's favorite Bitcoin maximalists. They kind of like were obviously dancing on ETH's grave after ETH kind of fell 94% in value. They were celebrating the death of Ethereum because they didn't like it, obviously. And then what ended up happening was they just kept spreading lots of misinformation. So that's why Eric and I were kind of like, we have to do this. We have to do this thing. We have to educate people. We need to make sure that Ethereum can survive and thrive. But we can't do that if everyone thinks that like Ethereum is a scam or Ethereum can't do this or can't do that. So that was kind of like the motivation there. But I mean, I can pause there. That kind of covers 2017, 2018, I think.
Yeah, I remember back around that time there was lots of people talking about EOS and like all these other chains, and they would pay a lot of money for marketing, but Ethereum was like, well, we're the best tech, so we don't have to really worry about that. But like without your efforts and Eric and all the rest who sort of came after, it'd be really hard to make sense of what's going on. Is that kind of what you were working on when you did start it? Were you sort of worried that there was all this marketing and misinformation out there, and then you thought, well, someone's got to do this, let's jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting you mentioned the other networks back then. I think what we were worried about was more people misunderstanding Ethereum, less so the actual kind of marketing and competition from other chains. I don't think any of us ever worried about the other chains, like from the community that I talked to and was a part of. It's just funny how like back then, there were obviously big competitors. I mean, EOS was like this thing that raised all this money, and everyone was like, EOS can scale, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be amazing. And then it kind of like went nowhere. And there was a lot of other chains as well, not just EOS. There was like Neo and Tron and Qtum. And I mean, there's a bunch of others out there that basically, I mean, they're still alive today. Obviously, it's very kind of like difficult for anything in crypto to go away, but I would consider them failed projects. They haven't been able to gain any traction. So yeah, I don't think we were worried about that back then. We were just worried about the fact that there were so many people that could be getting involved with Ethereum and could be learning more about Ethereum and becoming maybe even builders within the ecosystem, but they were being fed like completely wrong information from these people who had big followings too. Because the way, you know, Twitter works, I mean, Bitcoin has basically had a monopoly on Twitter in 2018. Like, as I said, like Ethereum was more on the Reddit side and the ETH trader side and didn't really have a presence on Twitter. And the Bitcoin, especially the Bitcoin Maximus, they had like hundreds of thousands of followers back then. And they were just kind of like spreading all this misinformation, all these outright lies. And we kind of got really frustrated because we're like, well, you know, our audience is so small. I had, you know, in 2018, I'm pretty sure I still had like only a few thousand followers by the end of it. And we were kind of like, you know, how do we break through this? How do we do more here? How do we make this scalable, even though our audience is so small? And that was kind of like one of the main motivations. But yeah, I think it just was born out of a frustration about that, not so much out of the fact that there were these competitor networks. We never really considered them to be anything serious, especially because like back then, I mean, the community was so small. Like there wasn't really any user base for these competitors to latch onto. Like the Ethereum user base was basically tiny itself. So, you know, who are these competitor networks actually going to tap into? And you know, the funny thing is I think now that the competitors actually tap into, you know, a lot of the existing Ethereum user base. And there's actually obviously a lot more activity happening too. But yeah, back then it was a different story, I think.
I guess at that time, like gas fees were nominal, right? It wasn't something that people had to toss up, and you didn't really have certain applications on different chains. So there wasn't that people going on over to say, you know, BSC or Avalanche, for example. Do you think with where things are at now, do you feel like that thing holding Ethereum back as a network in terms of just the demand to use the network is just so high?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends how you look at it and like what lens you view it in, and how you define, you know, economic activity and demand. I think the funny thing is that the Ethereum network, even though the fees are high, it's processing more economic activity than it ever has right now, at least at layer one, right? And I think more and more people are coming to understand that layer one Ethereum is not the place where end users are going to sit. It's going to be at layer two. And as I mentioned, a few of the names before in the layer two ecosystem, they're live and working today, and they have, you know, I mean, I think Arbitrum has pretty much most of the apps people, you know, regularly use on Ethereum, except Aave, which I think is coming soon. So you just look at that, and obviously the Polygon POS chain has been a really great kind of refuge for a lot of people who have been kind of priced out of layer one Ethereum. But what I've been really trying to hammer home myself for months now is that layer one Ethereum is really not, the way Ethereum is scaling at least, layer one Ethereum is not the place where Ethereum will scale in terms of like for end users. Ethereum is going to be doing scaling at layer one for the layer two. So it'll give more capacity for layer twos, but end users will sit at these layer two networks and enjoy like cheaper fees and faster transactions. Whereas I think, you know, these other competitor networks, some of them are saying, you know, we can scale everything at layer one. It's all going to be well and good. We're going to be awesome. It's all going to be decentralized. And I mean, I don't really buy into that. And also, I don't think technically you can actually scale everything at layer one. I do think you need a tiered approach through different layers. And, you know, on top of that as well, I think obviously these other networks have been getting traction because of Ethereum kind of pricing them out. But the funny thing is that, you know, you mentioned BSC and there's the Avalanche C chain and there's like Phantom and things like that. These things are literally just like Ethereum, right? They're just the EVM forked across, and that's why it's been so easy for developers to just deploy their existing code there because it's EVM compatible, and you know, which is obviously a big deal. And I think that just reinforces Ethereum's moat and kind of like reinforces those user behaviors of using Ethereum wallets and dealing with like Ethereum style transactions. So from that perspective, I wouldn't say I'm worried about that or thinking that Ethereum is like bleeding users. I would say that the pie is getting absolutely massive and demand for block space is just infinite. So I think that no matter how scalable other chains claim to be, they'll eventually hit limits and they'll have to kind of like do this tiered approach. And that's why I'm kind of like really excited that Ethereum is already on that path, because it means that like we don't want users going to layer one and getting trapped there because of fees. So if we have this vibrant layer two ecosystem that they can use in order to do all their stuff without having to worry about the fees getting away from them and being like hundreds of dollars, for example. So I know it's a bit more of a complex thing for especially newer users to grasp, because when you're a new user and you come into the ecosystem and you onboard to Ethereum, you're obviously going to go to layer one. And if you go to layer one, you're going to be shocked because you'll try to do like a Uniswap trade and it'll be like $50 in fees, and you'll be like, what the hell, this is ridiculous. And then you'll go to some other chain, it'll be the same experience, right? It'll be like an EVM, it'll probably have like Sushi Swap or something. You'll do like a trade, and it may be a few cents, obviously much cheaper than Ethereum. And then people will be, the new user will be like, wow, why would I use Ethereum when I can use this thing? Which is totally understandable, of course. Like, I don't think like we should expect new users to understand the nuances between decentralization and security and things like that. And most users won't. Most users won't even care. And that's why kind of like Ethereum has its layer 2 ecosystem, where it'll offer that experience, but also the layer 2s, when, in their final form and when constructed correctly, they do inherit Ethereum's security, because you can always kind of like exit to Ethereum if anything happens on the layer 2, like anything malicious. Whereas with these other chains, if anything malicious happens, you're at the mercy of their kind of like network of validators. So that's kind of like how I view it. I know it's sometimes hard for me to think from a new user perspective because of the fact that I'm so ingrained in the ecosystem, and because of the fact that I pay the layer 1 fees, and kind of, I don't know, the layer 1 fees are really, really high, but I feel like a lot of people who bought ETH really early on just do it, just pay it, because they're like, yeah, whatever. Like, the fees are high, but I bought ETH low, sort of thing. But obviously that doesn't apply to 99.99% of people. So that's why I've been trying to really, really push the layer 2 message, and push and say to people, hey, these things aren't coming, they're live, right? You can go play around with Arbitrum and Optimism right now, and basically have a really, really fun time on there with fast transactions and cheap transactions, using all the apps that everyone loves to use. So yeah, that's my general view of scaling and gas and all that sort of stuff.
Very cool. Maybe you can take us through all the currently available Ethereum sort of scaling solutions, so like the L2s, and then run through what each one is, and kind of what your view of each one is, and like what the payoffs are in terms of, scalability versus security, etc.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different solutions out there right now, and looking at it from that lens, I would say that they all have their own intricacies, their own trade-offs, their own benefits, and maybe drawbacks. So I'll probably start with the two that most people have probably used by now, and that's Arbitrum and Optimism. I would say most people have probably used Arbitrum because they have a full network where there's no whitelist to deploy applications, whereas Optimism still has a whitelist. So Arbitrum has more apps right now, and I've seen like a few of those yield farm things pop up on Arbitrum too. A lot of ohm forks actually. so there's two like main types of rollups right now. Optimistic rollup and a ZK rollup, and ZK rollup is sometimes called a validity rollup, which apparently is more accurate according to the researchers, but I'm just going to call it a ZK rollup because it just rolls off the tongue better. And the kind of main difference between the two right now is that Optimism and Arbitrum allow for kind of like arbitrary code execution, and what that means is that basically it's a generalized platform. It allows you to run things like all the popular DeFi apps, run and basically any kind of like code that you want. Whereas the ZK constructions right now are kind of like limited to simple payment like transfers and not any of the complex smart contract interactions that Arbitrum and Optimism can do. So that's kind of like the main difference right now. I think the other thing that I guess like affects users is that with optimistic rollups, they actually have like a 7-day withdrawal period, which is being rectified through the bridging protocols that now exist, where the bridges will allow you to essentially exit instantly or near instantly. But if you wanted to exit through the normal channels, it would take up to 7 days. Whereas ZK rollups do not suffer from that kind of like that limitation, but they are inherently more expensive to use for certain transactions, not for every transaction. It gets a bit complex when you start kind of like looking at all of that. But I think the main difference that users would care about is kind of like, is there apps on this thing? Like what apps are on there? And right now, ZK rollups are pretty good for like single app construction. So for example, DYDX is a ZK rollup, but the DYDX just does like simple transfers because the order book is hosted off chain, and anything that's posted as part of like the layer 2 is just like the simple kind of like swaps and sends and transfers, nothing arbitrarily complex or anything like that. That's where kind of like the optimistic rollups come in, and they're live today and they work and they're EVM compatible and all that good stuff. But and there is actually going to be ZK rollups that have generalized kind of like code deployment as well. Starkware has been teasing their Starknet alpha, which is going to mainnet next month, where they're basically saying, developers can build whatever they want on there. ZK Sync has a platform they're coming out with as well called ZK Sync 2.0, and they've also got something called ZK Porter. Polygon's working on ZK EVM with Hermes as well to do this. So I would say that like over time, the optimistic rollup and the ZK rollups in terms of features are just going to converge and basically be very similar. And I think a lot of people are betting on kind of like this ZK stuff being the long-term solution. It's still a little bit of a while away before we get to the point where we want them to be. But the ZK rollups, at least what the teams claim, is that they're more scalable than the optimistic ones, and kind of like they can do generalized application deployment as well. It remains to be seen. Like obviously, developers and researchers talk a big game about their own tech, and once it's actually live in production, we see what the kind of like real thing is. But that's kind of like the two main scaling solutions right now. But then you also have like the hybrid solutions, which without getting too technical, so the hybrid solutions is something like what Immutable X uses. So Immutable is an NFT. Immutable X is an NFT platform, and obviously NFTs, most of them aren't worth very much, so you can't really have gas fees eating into that. You need to be able to mint them really cheaply. You need to be able to trade them very cheaply. So the Immutable X runs on something called a Validium, which is Starkware's tech as well. And maybe I should take a step back and explain how these layer 2s work. The way the layer 2s, whether they're optimistic or ZK rollup, the way they work is they basically take the heavy lifting off of layer 1 Ethereum. And the heaviest lift that a layer 1 Ethereum has to do is executing the transaction. So actually using computational power to execute and process all the transactional activity. And the reason why this is most expensive is because of the fact that it is the heaviest work to do. It's the work that takes the longest, and it costs a lot on Ethereum layer 1 because of that. So if we can take all that off-chain, literally off-chain, like we can just run it on a server, but then the second part is that we'll still keep the lighter stuff on-chain, and the lighter stuff is a batch of the transaction. So what the layer 2 does is it basically wraps up all these transactions after processing them, batches them together, and puts just that one batch transaction on layer 1. And what that does is it says, hey, I did all these transactions on layer 2, here's the proof that I did it, and here's the batch of it. But like, because you're wrapping them all up into one batch, kind of like compressing a bunch of files, like with WinZip or something, as like an analogy I like to use, you're basically reducing the cost massively because you don't have to process those transactions at layer 1, and the costs come down by orders of magnitude. And then the second part is something called call data, which is basically a technical term for user state. So things like user balances and stuff like that. That also gets posted to layer 1. Now, what a Validium does, and that's different to like what the rollups do, is the Validium doesn't post the call data to layer 1. It keeps it off-chain as part of something called a data availability committee, and that actually gives you less security, because without the data, if for some reason you can't access the data anymore because the off-chain community basically is withholding it, or the off-chain community goes offline and basically is unavailable, then there's a potential for you not being able to withdraw your funds back to layer 1 because you don't have that necessary data. But Validium still posts its proofs of its transactions to layer 1 as part of those batches, so it's still more secure than something that lives off of Ethereum completely. So those are kind of like the main things right now. And as I mentioned before, ZK Porter from ZK Sync is a solution that is very similar to a Validium. It uses an off-chain data committee as well. But it's still very, very early in these kind of like stages right now. I think, we're really at kind of like the day 1 of layer 2 in terms of like deployment. The research has been going on for years, of course, but in terms of getting it out there, getting it adopted, we're just really, really early in that. But hopefully that gives like maybe a high level overview of L2s. There's definitely a lot more to it, a lot more to talk about. But I think for end users, what really matters is being able to go onto a platform that gives them, all the applications that they know and love from layer 1, not just like these single application things.
Very cool. So in the next couple of months, we're going to see these generalized ZK rollups. But as you said, you can be a little bit skeptical about whether or not they're going to be like fully functional or whatever, given that Optimism kind of said, oh, we're going to launch in March, and then we didn't really see anything until like July. So are you hopeful that we are going to see much cheaper ZK generalized scalability in the next couple of months? And then what happens to that when we have the merge next year, where Ethereum moves from proof of work to proof of stake?
Just to add on to that, I'll also throw in what happens when sharding is thrown into the equation as well.
So maybe I should take a step back with the ZK stuff, or the generalized ZK stuff that's being kind of like built right now. And maybe I'll just use Starkware as an example here. What they've built is not EVM compatible. It is not kind of like, they're not taking the EVM and basically saying, hey, you know, you can build Solidity apps on here. What they're doing is that they've built their own language called Cairo, and they've built their own platform called StarkX, which is basically their own like kind of virtual machine that processes things. And they're kind of like not going the EVM compatibility path. But in saying that, they have tools that allow developers to do what's called transpile their code from Solidity to Cairo in order to have the applications live on here. But because of that, it's going to be a slower rollout, because with EVM compatible or EVM equivalent systems, really all developers have to do is just port across. They don't really have to change much. Most of the tooling works the same way, and there's not really much work to do there. Whereas with something like Starknet, they're going to have to do a bit more work, and you know, they may have to kind of like get audits done again as well, because if they're transpiling to like to new code, not everything's going to come across one-to-one. There may be bugs. You obviously don't want to launch something with new bugs that have been introduced, so it's going to take a bit longer there. And that tech is much newer than the optimistic rollup tech as well. So I would say that in the next couple of months, you'll start seeing some generalized ZK stuff, but it's not going to be like what optimistic rollups have right now. I think it's going to take a bit longer still, especially because, I mean, they're calling it Starknet Alpha. It's not even a beta version. So it's obviously still very, very early. So I think from that perspective, it's probably going to take longer than people think. But also, there are ZK teams working on generalized EVM compatible ZK rollups. So ZK EVM is something that's being worked on. Polygon's working on this in a big way with Hermes. And there's a few other teams working on ZK EVM as well, but that's probably going to take a little while to come out too. So I would say that, you know, the ZK stuff, don't be surprised if there's like quote unquote delays or it takes longer than people expect. And that's why I think like focusing on the optimistic rollup stuff is the best kind of solution right now, because it does offer those kind of cheaper transactions and faster transactions right now. And it allows developers to really easily just build their stuff on top of this without having to change much. So that's kind of like the view of what it's like right now. So hopefully that clears that part up for you guys. I think the next thing you mentioned was the merge. So the thing about the merge is that it's a huge upgrade for the Ethereum network, obviously, but essentially what the merge is, and this is all, I mean, maybe I'm underselling it, but I mean, it's a big upgrade, but from the highest level, all that happens in the merge is that we replace proof of work with proof of stake. Nothing else happens. Like there's no change in scalability. There's no kind of like change for users. There's no kind of like big migration that anyone has to do. It literally is, you know, one specific block, we're going to be on proof of work. On the next block, we're going to be on proof of stake. That's it. And obviously, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for doing this. The major reason being that, as I mentioned before, Ethereum has been working on proof of stake for a long time. We've been moving towards it. It's not like a new thing that happened. But also the Ethereum community and ecosystem considers proof of stake to be much more secure than proof of work, much more long-term sustainable. And also, you know, whatever side of the fence you sit on with this debate, the Ethereum community believes that proof of work is very wasteful for, you know, the environment. So proof of stake is much better because we get a better bang for your buck. But, you know, there are pros and cons to both. There are trade-offs, but there's always trade-offs no matter what you do. So that's good to keep in mind as well. Obviously, I'm a big fan of proof of stake, and specifically Ethereum's proof of stake, because it's good to keep in mind that not all of them are created equal. There's a lot of them that are very, very, very different to Ethereum's proof of stake, so it's not really worth comparing them. But yeah, that's basically the merge. And I think the funny thing is what end users are actually going to care about the most with the merge, or at least with what most end users will care about the most, I think, will be the fact that the new issuance or the new ETH issuance each year is dropping dramatically. So right now, the Ethereum network pays about 4.5% a year in issuance to miners. New issuance, I should say. And obviously we have EIP 1559 that's burning pretty much like on average 50% of all ETH. So you could say that net issuance is basically half of 4.5% right now. But still the new issuance going to miners, which has to be sold to cover costs, is around 4.5%. Now, when the merge happens, new issuance going to stakers is dramatically less at current staked amount. So the more ETH that gets staked, the more issuance that gets paid out. But at current staked amount, which is about 8 million ETH, The issuance is, I think, 0.65% or something like that. So that is a massive difference, 4.5% to 0.65%. And that's basically going to happen within one block. We're going to basically have an issuance reduction of almost 90%. And then, of course, there's still going to be the burn, the burning of ETH happening, which means that we're going to go to a net deflationary ETH. So I think that's what most people are kind of excited about. But in terms of like end user impact of the merge, there's none. Essentially, what happens is that everyone will still be using the Ethereum they know and love today. It'll just be being verified and secured, and all the transactions will be packaged up by the kind of like proof of stake consensus mechanism instead of proof of work.
Is the block size the same?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the block size is determined by the block gas limit, which is, I guess, what people call ETH1 today, which is the Ethereum we know and love today. But that block gas limit is going to stay the same, yes, post-merge. There is, as I said, like it doesn't change any of the scaling stuff or anything like that. Literally all it does is replace proof of work with proof of stake. The one thing that does change, I guess, is the block times. They do get a little bit shorter, but I mean, not by much. I don't think the end users are gonna feel that. But yeah, I mean, that's basically all that changes, I should say. Sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, hopefully we'll all be on Rollups by then. So after the merge happens, what's sort of next for Ethereum? Is the sort of sharding, does that happen in like 2023, or is that, I mean, obviously they can't say when it's going to be, but like our best guess, and then sort of what does that unlock for Ethereum with data sharding?
So I mean, as Darren kind of like said before, just wanted me to touch on sharding here. So dates around this sort of stuff is obviously dubious. I think, if I was to give like a launch window for the merge, I would say Q2 next year. But like, that's just my estimation. That's not what the core devs have said or anything like that. So just take that with a grain of salt. That's just based on what I'm kind of like seeing, and I guess like what they want to work towards as well from a date for the merge. But in terms of sharding, yeah, I wouldn't expect to see sharding till 2023. But what I think a lot of people get confused about with sharding is that they think that it's going to scale layer 1 for end users, where in fact it is not. So what sharding does is it basically gives much more scalability to layer 2s. And the reason is because the sharding that Ethereum is going with is called data sharding. Now, as I explained before, these layer 2s have something called core data that they have to post onto layer 1 in order to be considered a true kind of like layer 2, a true rollup. Now, obviously, Ethereum layer 1 has limited capacity for this core data, because the layer 2s have to compete with everyone else on the layer 1 Ethereum network for block space, and to put this core data on there. So what sharding does, it essentially gives much more space for these layer 2s to put their data onto, their core data onto, and that's why we call them data shards. The shards themselves aren't places where you can do transactions, and users can kind of like interact with apps and stuff like that. That was the original kind of like plan. That was called execution sharding. But the reason why that was kind of changed is a couple of things. Execution sharding is very complex. It is definitely adds a lot more overhead to the chain itself, and it has the potential to make the chain kind of like unstable and insecure. So from that perspective, we kind of like just said, okay, well, what can we do with sharding? Well, the researchers, they kind of asked, what can we do with sharding to enhance Ethereum scalability? And what they came up with was data sharding, where it's basically like, okay, well, we have all this layer 2 ecosystem that exists and that is very vibrant right now. Why don't we just give them the tools that they need to scale even further? So with sharding, we could potentially scale up to millions of transactions per second at these layer 2s, because they're going to have much more room to store their data on. And that's all that's going to happen on the shards. And I mean, I guess to take a step back, the shards are basically just like new blockchains, essentially, where basically you would split up the Ethereum network into different kind of like shards. And then the validators would validate all the shards, and the layer 2s would be able to post their core data to the shards instead of having to just post it to one Ethereum network. They initially get to post it to 64 different shards, and that would obviously give you 64x the scalability, but then we can add more shards over time. And this is the beauty about Ethereum, is that it actually gets more scalable with the more decentralized it gets. This is normally a thing that everyone thought was impossible, where they're like, oh, in order to scale, you need to centralize more. But with Ethereum's roadmap and with sharding, what ends up happening is that if you have more validators, so a validator in proof of stake is anyone who stakes 32 ETH, So if you have more validators, you can actually add more shards, because the validators, there's a certain number that has to be assigned to each shard to validate it. And you obviously hit a limit depending on how many validators you have. But the more validators you add to the network, at the moment it's 250,000. Say you add like 1 million, you can have potentially 4 times more shards added. So you could go from 64 shards to 200, over 200 shards, and that gives even more scalability to the layer 2 ecosystem. So that's kind of like Ethereum's longer term roadmap there in terms of scaling, but it really is all focusing on these layer 2s and enhancing them and ensuring that they can scale, to millions of transactions per second. And layer 1 just remains this very, very secure kind of like settlement layer where the layer 2s basically settle all their transactions and their call data too.
Very cool. Thanks, Sassal. So with optimistic rollups, just quickly, are we going to see in the near term faster and cheaper optimistic rollups? And then we might just jump to quickly talking about wallets and security, and then we can take some questions from the audience.
I would say that they both, all rollups have a fixed cost, and that fixed cost is the call data, and that cost can only come down with layer 1 gas fees. So if the layer 1 gas fees, keep going up, that cost will unfortunately keep going up on the call data side. But as I said, like sharding comes into it later on, which basically gives much more room for call data to be stored, which basically means that those fixed costs drop dramatically. So that's where I think the biggest improvements will come. But yeah, right now, Arbitrum and Optimism are not running anywhere near their capacity. They could both do thousands of transactions per second, but there's obviously not the demand for that yet. And none of these networks have demand for thousands of transactions per second, mind you. Not yet. They will probably in the future, but right now, the Arbitrum and Optimism are basically just in beta. I think they probably do just the same amount of transactions per second that Ethereum L1 does, but because they're not as congested, the fees are much cheaper. But if they do end up getting congested and they do hit their limits that they have in place right now, they can basically just increase those limits up to thousands of transactions per second. So that's kind of like the current state of play for that.
Awesome. We might just move to wallet security, so we can just spend a couple of minutes on it. And I just wanted to see what your thoughts are, like what's kind of your recommendations for the best hardware wallet, the best mobile wallet, and then sort of the best browser native wallet, and maybe just a quick reason why.
I think when talking about like wallets and like what's best and what's not, again, it comes back to trade-offs in like features and practicality and functionality. So I might be a little bit of a boomer for still preferring Metamask, and I know Metamask lacks a lot of features in terms of I guess like a wallet interface. It basically doesn't have like any of the bells and whistles, right? It doesn't have direct DeFi integration. It doesn't have like an NFT kind of like section that displays your NFTs for you or anything. It doesn't have any of the fancy bells and whistles. But what Metamask does have is a long track record of being extremely secure and extremely battle tested and extremely reliable. Like I know a lot of people have issues with Metamask, but over time it's gotten a lot better. And for me, it's just like all reliable, right? As they call it. So, and there isn't really any kind of like browser extension wallets, or not, at least not many of them yet, that are comparable to Metamask. I know that there's things like XDeFi, but XDeFi is currently not open source, so I personally don't trust it, because if it's not open source, how do I know that something dodgy isn't going on? And then there's I think there's Rabi or something like that from the DBank team, which again is much newer, so I don't really trust it that much, to be honest. Obviously, I'm not saying they're bad products, but the fact that MetaMask has been around for so long and has been kind of like secure and is built by a lot of the core Ethereum folk that have been around for a while, I just trust it a lot more than any of these other ones right now. In terms of like a browser wallet, there's also Rainbow Wallet, which is really cool. They have a really cool NFT display, kind of like integration there. And there's a bunch of others. I mean, there's tons of mobile wallets, but I don't really use them myself too much. And then it comes to like the hardware wallets, which is what everyone should be using as their default wallet and their default storage. My favorite in terms of like being the most secure is the Lattice One from Grid Plus. So Lattice One is is in terms of like practicality, it is probably not as practical as something like a Ledger Nano, because a Ledger Nano is much smaller. A Lattice one is kind of like something that you keep at your kind of PC. It doesn't really come anywhere with you. It's not portable, but it's much more kind of like secure. It has so many security features that if someone was able to break into it, you would just give them all your money anyway, because you're like, wow, that's impressive. And you can go to Good Plus's website for the Lattice one to actually look at all the features. They have things like, you know, tamper-proof resistance and kind of like all these military-grade encryption and security. It's actually insane how much they've been able to pack into this device. But as I said, it's not as practical as something like a Ledger because it's not really portable. It needs dedicated power. It's a little bit of a bulky device. But in saying that, it is much more secure. But I think for most users, you know, especially kind of like the newer users, that they probably use something like a Ledger as a hardware wallet. There's also Trezor and stuff like that, but I've used Ledger pretty much my whole crypto career. And you know, the hardware wallets are much better than something like a browser wallet or a mobile wallet. Maybe not so much a mobile. Some of the mobile wallets are really good as well, but I think a hardware wallet is great because it keeps the private keys on the device and it keeps them secure, keeps them separate from everything. But they're still kind of like subject to different attack vectors. Like for hardware wallets, for example, there's an attack vector called a man-in-the-middle attack, where essentially you can be tricked into signing a transaction on your hardware wallet that wasn't actually what you wanted to sign. And Ledger actually won't give you much information on the screen of exactly what you're signing. So you may just end up signing it without realizing at all and having no idea what you just signed. Whereas this is where the Lattice one differs, where it actually has like a full screen and it will show you exactly what you're signing, which I think is really, really cool, especially for higher value transactions. So yeah, there's kind of like a wide ecosystem of wallets across like all the spectrums, but it really comes down to like what's practical, but also, you know, very, very secure for most users, and like what features do you want out of a wallet as well. I think as time goes on, we're going to get those wallets that have lots of features, but also super, super secure. But as I said, like I'm a bit of a boomer. I like to stick to my MetaMask. I don't need all the bells and whistles at the wallet level. I'm happy to kind of like have all the bells and whistles somewhere else, like something like Zapper. I use Zapper as a dashboard tracker to track all my positions and stuff like that. And I think Zapper was teasing that they're working on a wallet as well or something. So yeah, you know, those kind of worlds are coming together as well. But yeah, that's kind of like my view of the wallet ecosystem right now.
Yeah, Zapper's kind of just blows everyone else away when it comes to sort of getting all your DeFi positions in one place. You find out you own stuff you totally forgot about. So are you okay to stay around for like 10 or 15 minutes to take some questions, Sassal?
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So if anyone has some questions, you can chuck them in the chat or just stick up your hand and we'll bring you up on stage. Welcome.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good, man.
Hey, thanks for bringing me up.
Of course. What question do you have for Sassal?
So one of the things that I've been wondering about in terms of the price of ETH is if we have an SEC-approved spot ETF for ETH, but we would have this actor in the personhood of the exchange-traded fund company buying ETH for a non-crypto purpose, so just simply to hold it in an instrument that's freely tradable on a stock exchange. I'm wondering what that would do in terms of price metrics for Ethereum.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think it's kind of like hard to tell what the demand's going to be for a spot ETF in the US, considering that we don't have one yet. There's only kind of like the futures ETF for Bitcoin. The demand for that was already high, so I think using that as a proxy for demand for something like an ETF, and obviously a spot ETF is what we want to see, there would be a lot of demand, and I think that it's funny when you look at supply and demand dynamics and look at kind of like how the buying pressure affects the wider market. It does take longer to play out than people normally think. People kind of say, oh, you know, there's all this kind of like supply that's being eaten up. It means the price is going to rocket up. We're going to double from here. And I think that's not exactly how it happens. I think when larger institutions, especially ETFs and kind of like larger buyers are buying these things, they obviously don't want to disturb the price, right? They want to get in at the best price possible, and they don't want to make anyone aware that they're actually buying this large position. So essentially what they'll do is a lot of the time they'll do OTC, which still hits the spot market, of course, because if the OTC broker doesn't have enough coin, they're going to have to get it from somewhere, right? but they'll do like time weighted average kind of like entries. And I think the ETFs will work similarly to this as well, where that, they'll essentially kind of like try not to disturb the market. But obviously over time, as the supply shrinks and the demand either stays constant or increases, the price should gradually go up. So, I mean, I can't think of any reason why a spot ETF would be negative for ETH. I think that even if it gets like approved, there'll be kind of like what happened with Bitcoin, right? There's like been a hype, kind of like price rise, and then kind of like we come down and we kind of like settle into a bit of a range for a while and then continue back up over time. I think that people just overestimate the impact in the short term and probably underestimate the impact in the long term.
Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. Thanks for the question, Domino. We had another one from MJ Rossman. He says, what would you think is the best incentive for users and developers to start, their L2 kind of setup for the communities and projects?
In terms of incentive, I guess there's two ways to take that, right? It's like the normal incentive, like why would users want to go to layer 2, and then maybe an incentive for like a liquidity mining program. So I think it's pretty clear why users would want to go to layer 2. Obviously, it's to save on gas costs, and obviously, they may be totally priced out of layer 1. They can't afford the gas costs at all. So there would be that incentive. But then in terms of like developers doing their own liquidity mining programs and stuff like that, I would say, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of liquidity mining programs because a lot of them are very parasitic. I would say that if they're going to do them, they should do them in a conservative way, but they should also kind of like wait. They should just like try and get as much organic traction as possible before doing liquidity incentives, because it's good for bootstrapping, but in terms of like having an organic community that sits there and actually uses the stuff kind of like long term, it can be detrimental to that. So yeah, I mean, that's probably like the high level overview of how I look at these things.
So in other words, wait till Olympus Pro is available on L2.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. We got a question from Brian. He's Brian Peace is quite active within our DAO. How you going, Brian?
I'm doing good. Excited for this conversation. Yeah, big fan of all you guys. So all this talk about layer 2 and cross-chain stuff brings up the thought in my mind about bridges and bridging, and there's 1,000 different bridging protocols. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about bridges and sort of like whatever trade-offs there might be between different aspects of them.
Yeah, I mean, the bridge space is kind of massive. I think there's a lot of different kind of solutions here. There's centralized and custodial bridges. Then there's ones that act more like cross-chain decentralized exchanges. And then there's other ones that kind of just act as like message parsers and stuff like that. I'm not like up to speed on the specifics of like each and every solution out there. I think that there's just going to be a world of these solutions doing bridging in different kind of ways. I actually saw one the other day called Across network, which basically is doing bridging between L2 and L1 by using short-term loans. So there's like all these different approaches that are kind of coming online over time. And I think that there's a lot of innovation in the bridge space to be had still. And there's obviously a lot of trade-offs as well with bridges. I think the bridge terminology is actually a bit misleading, because when you cross a real-life bridge, you go from one point to the other. When you cross a cross-chain bridge, technically you're just locking your funds on one side and minting them on the other, but it's more like an IOU. So for example, a lot of people will be familiar with Polygon and the POS chain and bridging across to that network. So what ends up happening is that you put your funds into the Polygon bridge from Ethereum, you get your funds on Polygon, but what you have on Polygon is basically an IOU. If anything was to happen to those funds on Ethereum, then your funds on Polygon, or at least the funds that corresponded to the ones in the bridge, would become worthless, for example. And that's actually how a lot of these bridges work right now. So that's obviously a risk and a trade-off there. And then with the kind of like cross-chain swapping, it kind of like also inherits those risks, but it gets a bit murky when you think about it, because people say, well, if I bridge across and then trade away the asset that I bridged for another asset, then it means I'm not holding that risk anymore because I'm in a different asset. And it's like, well, where is that asset? Like, is that asset actually native to the network, or did it come across the bridge and that asset is actually backed up by the asset in the bridge? So I think this is something obviously that is very, I mean, obviously the bridges are just like very new over the last few months and getting usage now. But I think it's something that users really need to probably kind of like be conscious of, because there is a big risk there, of course. And, I'm actually waiting for the day because I think it's inevitable where there's just like a massive kind of like hack on one of these bridges. We already saw, I think, with the Poly network bridge, which wasn't Polygon, it was a different thing, where there was kind of like this massive exploit that happened, but I think the funds got returned. But like that can happen to any of the bridges, especially the ones that kind of like hold funds in like this one contract and are doing a bridge in that kind of like capacity. So I think that's the main kind of like thing to think about, is that there's just all these trade-offs when it comes to these bridges. They do it in different ways, and you always want to have like the native token. Like for example, if you've bridged across to another network, you have the IOU, but if you're on Ethereum and you have ETH, then you have the native token. ETH on Ethereum is ETH. It's real ETH. It is not an IOU of anything. There is no kind of like counterparty, no contract telling you, hey, like I'm holding your kind of like real ETH and I'll give it to you if it's still here, like when you come to redeem it. Whereas there are assets like that on Ethereum, of course, and there are also things like if you put your ETH into a smart contract, well, then you're at the mercy of that smart contract. That smart contract is basically giving you the promise that it'll let you withdraw it, but if it gets hacked or something, then or exploited, like we've seen plenty of times play out, that ETH is not going to be there, and you won't be able to get it back. It's a kind of like very similar to the way the bridging works. So that's what users should be aware of. But at the same time, for us to scale this stuff to the world, I think users shouldn't have to think about that at all. So eventually we're just going to have to push the developers, push the kind of like builders to have these bridging solutions that have as little risk and as little kind of like centralized points of failure as possible. Otherwise, there could be tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions in these bridges one day. And if it gets kind of like exploited or hacked, it could get very messy.
Yeah, that's wild. We won't keep you any longer. You've already given us an hour and a bit now. So how should Ohmies, if they want to stay up to date with your education efforts, there's the newsletter and the Daily Gwei, and maybe just tell them how they can follow you. And we'll also post links, of course.
Yeah. I mean, you could just go to my Twitter profile, and my pinned tweet has links to the newsletters that I do, the podcast that I do, and the YouTube show that I do as well. So I do the Daily Gwei newsletter and YouTube video every weekday. So the YouTube video just covers the last kind of like 24 hours in the Ethereum ecosystem. It's about a half an hour video each day. And then the newsletter just focuses on one topic from the day in Ethereum or crypto and just does a deeper dive on that. The EthHub newsletter is a weekly newsletter that covers Ethereum, and the EthHub podcast is a recap, is a podcast form, of the newsletter that I do with Eric Connor, my co-founder of EthHub. So yeah, that's kind of like my day-to-days. I'm very active on Twitter. For those of you who probably already follow me, you'll know that. And I'm a pretty good top signal for ETH. So if you want to counter trade me, definitely follow me on Twitter. But yeah, that's kind of like how you can follow all my work.
And that's at Sassal.eth?
Yeah, at Sassal0x. So Sassal 0x. Yeah.
I also just want to congratulate you on entire year of Daily Gwei. I think you've eclipsed 365 episodes now, which is super awesome, and just like that's an awesome achievement considering how much how fast things in the space move.
Thanks guys. Yeah, I mean it's easy to do since I'm so involved and passionate about Ethereum. So just keep doing it, keep the community educated. As I said, that was like a major thing for me during the bear market, and it still continues to be. I think that if we didn't have these educational pillars, not just me, but like Bankless and others, Ethereum wouldn't be where it is today. So yeah, gonna keep doing that for the foreseeable future. That's for sure.
100%.
Thanks so much for coming and speaking with us, Sassal.
Thanks for having me, guys. Thanks everyone for listening.